come back. Having looked at the issues affecting disruption, it would be useful to look at how that is affected by climate change and sustainability. So, John, you're quite an expert on this, so I wonder if you'd mind giving us a brief summary.
Okay, well, there is this organisation, which I have to say, set up by the British government again, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which we initially funded, which is an oversight organisation funded by the United Nations, or certainly global input of cash, to monitor and predict the future scenario, if you will. So this fits with what we're talking about. And that is arguably an attempt at answering the most complex question that humanity has ever faced. This makes a shot to the moon or even Mars trivial. And this is not a euphemism, I really mean it. The science is so complicated when it comes to climate change. There are well-known physicists, climatologists, chemists that say that the answer to this may not be possible because the system is so dynamic. So as we study it, small changes mean that you cannot create an overarching perfect model of where we are going into the future. It might not be possible, not with our current level of understanding. As we move forwards in our understanding, it might change. So this body exists to try and do that, and every 3 to 5 years it publishes material which is produced by the thousands of scientists that it requests information from. It is then peer reviewed, which is very important. So that means that other scientists look at the data, decide which is safe and which is questionable. And once it goes through that process, which can take in excess of a year, that material is then pulled together and then published and delivered to the rest of the world. And that is not only the largest scientific output that I am aware of, but also one of the most reliable pieces of data. And that data says things are very, very serious. That we are on a pathway to 2 degrees warming, and once you reach 2 degrees, here's the nub. When you reach 2 degrees, it's almost inevitable to then go to 4 degrees as you try and adapt to 2 degrees.
Can you explain the significance of 2 degrees and what that really means in reality?
That's a really good question because it has no scientific basis. A lot of people put a scientific underpinning to it, but the reality is it is a political decision. It is a political decision. They asked the scientists, politicians asked the scientists, at what point would you pick that is really important? And so the scientists said, well, when we cross 2 degrees, at the moment we are 1 degree warmer than when we started in the industrialization process, so we're halfway there. And the scientists went, well, roughly, if we double where we are now, in terms of the challenges in our climate, things will not be twice as bad as they are now because it's an exponential curve. It gets worse as you get further down it. So it's one of those curves. So 1 degree is quite bad. What are we seeing now?
Exponential.
It could be exponential. It might even be logarithmic. So exponential doubles with time. Logarithmic goes by a factor of 10 with time. And I personally have a terrible feeling that the changes lie somewhere between those 2 points.
So if I was thinking, should I stay in Europe or go, what would I think about to think about how that might mitigate a future?
Well, the world that we're looking at the moment, we're seeing most social unrest underpinned by climatic shifts. So Syria,
so
North Africa.
But I still want to come back to what does it mean in practical terms, this 1 degree? So because
okay.
I mean, it's like when you're saying this will this room will hold X amount of cubic water, for example, that means nothing to me. How many kettles does that?
Right, okay.
So can we have some practical
So
examples?
the practical, 2 degrees. 2 degrees destabilises all of North Africa in terms of food production. Because weather patterns will change, and the current agricultural activities, as they are, will be unviable. Because there won't be the rains in
So
the
it will-
pattern that we have adapted to for growing food and raising livestock.
So what you're saying is it changes the life cycle of food production?
Well, it just will be different. Some people say that it will be 2 degrees actually raises you above viability for human activity, formal activity. I mean, you can always live. I mean, humans can live in extreme environments with enough technology and such that. But I'm talking about without significant amounts of technology, it becomes unviable to have an economy 2 degrees warmer in North Africa. That's North Africa, right? Most of our areas that absorb carbon, so that's our ocean areas, our forestry areas, at the moment they absorb carbon through time due to the drawing of carbon dioxide. And recently there was a paper published saying that the world is a lot greener than it was 20 or 30 years ago, because the extra carbon in the atmosphere is acting as a fertilizer for all of these plants, and they're drawing more carbon than we thought. And everybody raised this as like, woo, because the plants are saving the day. And actually, whilst that's been happening, the amount of carbon in our atmosphere has been growing at roughly somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times faster than we would expect if nature only was to do with that. So humans are raising the amount of carbon in our atmosphere, even though nature is pulling vast quantities of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, about 100 to 1,000 times faster than we would normally expect. And if we reach 2 degrees, and I can't know this for certain, but it is my belief, many arboreal wooded areas flip from carbon absorbers to carbon emitters.
And that then will increase the
And
carbon.
what do I mean by that? I mean by that the earliest evidence of this is Indonesia and, interestingly, Canada today on the 4th of May that we are. If you look at the news reports today, there is a forest fire in Western Canada that is so large
It's out of control.
they are evacuating 60,000 people from a city. They cannot put the forest fire out. They've given up trying. Indonesia last year had a 3,000 mile long fire line along its forests. So the fire was the edge of the fire was 3,000 miles. Last year, Indonesia was number 5 in carbon emitter on the planet. They produced nothing. Why was it number 5? Because their forests were producing carbon dioxide. These are 2 pinprick events that are, in my opinion, what will happen across
So
the
it's
planet.
like a piece of cloth catching in little places.
And at 2 degrees, the
Gradually
fire
it-
spreads.
Right, okay.
So you've got agriculture in North Africa, you've got forestry delivering carbon into the atmosphere, which then creates a feedback loop. So carbon in itself isn't poisonous. Carbon dioxide in itself is not poisonous. We all breathe it out, that's fine. But what it does is it speeds the next process, which is significant melt of glaciers, and most disturbing is kind of the release of other gases, a feedback loop, which is what I was saying, that once you reach 2 degrees, so you've got minor destabilization of our ecosystem, of our agricultural production, Siberia begins to melt, the permafrost begins to melt, agricultural activity, of which there's significant amounts, begins to become very difficult. In the center of the grain basket of the US, possibly becomes unviable. We've seen what's happened in California over the last 10 years. The drought there, although has been given a small amount of respite due to El Nino, there's been a bit of rain, that they are on the verge of collapse in California. That is serious, but not catastrophic globally. If that 2 degrees hits the Midwest, the grain basket of the US, and pushes that used to be a desert. The Midwest of the US is a desert. If you dig down, and I kind of have, if you dig down 1 hand depth into the grasslands in the Midwest and pull it back Underneath that is just sand. It's not soil.
So,
It's sand. It's desert.
so if you're thinking about futures in Europe, sort of which sort of setup might help protect or mitigate some of these things?
Well, it's often said
in
that
the
the
future.
UK produces only 5% of the global CO2 emissions, and so if the UK tomorrow said, right, we're not producing any more CO2, we're going to save the planet, the reality is that 95% of the damage continues with the planet. However, you might say as a trading nation, if we work out how to do that, and the rest of the world, I would argue, might agree, buys it, that would be
So
interesting.
is the EU working together to try and crack that nut in terms of keeping its own legislation tight to reduce pollution?
It is for the countries that probably wouldn't pursue this. So for the countries, Eastern European countries, the poorer Mediterranean countries, definitely. The UK,
They have to sign up to
they
it.
have to raise their game.
So we're protecting ourselves in those areas.
But does Britain need Europe for its current drive towards a more efficient, sustainable energy, food?
I would hazard a guess that it doesn't.
It doesn't need it, but if it comes up with something awesome, let's say
Which-
it did.
You mean Europe or the UK?
No, the UK, let's say UK came up with a solution, or many solutions, which of course is what it is, it would be perhaps easier to introduce those solutions across 28, 30 countries very quickly, because they're all part of the the European Union, and prove the point.
Rather than banging on the door, hey, we've got a
Hey, look at
solution.
us, and somebody goes, yeah, whatever, So it's again about trade. But if we came up with something awesome, sorry, I keep using that word, maybe the world would buy it,
Yeah,
and maybe
actually-
Europe would want it.
they would.
Actually, the UK, by all accounts from this report, has done the most work to get the most done in terms of climate and sustainability.
So how was all that funded? How, do
Through
we
the money
do we
that-
get research money from within or without
It all
Europe?
comes from
So
Europe, it gets paid into Europe and Europe pays it out.
would-
Well, the
how
European
would-
Union is
how
funded.
would that affect our ability to be at the cutting edge of research? How much money do we get from Europe, and how much money comes from just industry funded?
Well, over the last 20 years, Europe has, without a doubt, funded the environmental, especially the climate change, and most notably the green energy agenda that Britain is now bought into and gone surpassed. But I wonder whether or not we'd have even engaged in that without Europe saying, by 2010, we'd like 10% of Europe powered by renewable energy back in the noughties. And everyone fought it and then accepted it, and we've led. I don't think it was any accident that the last global meeting was in Paris. Europe is seen as being the kind of the centre for all of that.
So as a business, you'd have to look at what your future developments were and where the sort of funding for your research and your investment might come from.
And that's a wonderful future world where humanity sees that we've got a problem, throws all of our resources into that problem, comes up with a number of solutions, of which it is almost, there is no single solution, comes up with the whole basket of solutions, and then introduces them across Europe, then across the world, and everything's done. Now, I believe that's a fantasy. I just don't believe Europe is capable of it. I want to be wrong, but I think we needed to do this 20 years ago, and unless anybody's got a time machine, we're done. Personally,
Whether we leave or not.
I believe that most wholeheartedly. Unless the world initiates a program that makes World War II its model in terms of its transition of economic and
Rerouting.
manufacturing rerouting,
Rebooting.
that reboot Earth 2.0 within 6 months to a year, even a reboot won't work.
Well, I think all one needs to do is look at what's going on in the environment.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to get snow in Switzerland.
I see no evidence.
And melting of the North and South Pole, and poor quality ice in the Himalayas.